Joining us now is Executive Vice President for the Quincy Institute, Dr. Trita Parsi, great friend of the show. It's great to see you, sir. Thanks for joining us.
Good to see you.
So we wanted to have you on. Obviously, there's protests going on right now in Iran. Let's put this up there on the screen. So you wrote a piece here specifically about the Iranian regime, the handling of these protests, what it tells us about both the situation and their own problems and allergy to reform and why it's bred violence. Just first of all, for the audience, can you just lay out why exactly these protests are happening and then what they reveal a little bit about the current social situation in Iran?
Sure. So these protests were triggered by the so-called morality police arresting a young 22-year-old woman for not wearing her headscarf correctly, and then she died in their custody, and clearly something must have happened. Her father says that she was beaten up in custody and eventually died from that beating. And there's a massive outrage throughout all of society, not just amongst those who are against the headscarf, but actually also a lot of conservatives who favor the headscarf, perhaps even favor the law making it mandatory, but still find problem with this. And this has then triggered some of the biggest protests we have seen for several years now in Iran. And they're very different in many different aspects. I would say one thing that is quite striking here is that previous protests tended to focus on a specific policy, like the 2019 or 2017 one were economically driven. And only after the regime started clamping down on them violently did they become a little bit more forward-leaning in their demand and starting questioning the Islamic Republic as a whole. These protests, almost from the beginning, started not focusing just on a policy, but actually on the very structure of the Islamic Republic and calling for regime change. The people protesting are a bit different because we see there's a lot of young people who are no more than 10 years old in 2009, when you had some of the biggest protests in Iran's history with more than 2 million people on the streets in Tehran. These are now 20-year-olds, 18 to 20-year-olds. And it seems very clear after 20 years of attempts at reform, which have been blocked and stymied by various factors, this new generation seems to have lost any faith that the regime is capable of being able to meet their demands, and as a result are going directly for regime change. And that's quite different from what we've seen before.
How widespread are the protests, and how much of an actual threat to the regime do you think that they pose?
They have now taken place in more than 90 cities. So it is quite widespread. They may not be in the same numbers as what we saw in 2009, but it's very widespread, and it's going through many of the cities that traditionally have not had a lot of protests. The regime doesn't seem to act as if they view it as a major threat, and they may be completely miscalculating. They may calculate that they can clamp down and through repression quell these protests, and they may be right in that. But even if they do so, they're only sowing the seeds for future protests, because as long as there is no willingness by the regime to give some space to people, in this case, they're asking for some basic dignity. As long as they're not willing to do so, you're going to see more protests, and they're going to become more radicalized in their demands compared to what they have been in the past. So it's not a winning formula for the regime itself if it just thinks that resorting to violence and repression will save the day for them.
You know, at the same time, Dr. Parsi, this is what we always say. It's very difficult. You know, we're here. We're not there on the ground. We can see that the protests are happening. Obviously, there's cheerleading on a lot of sides. Like, this is going to be finally it. But I've seen a lot of protests in Iran. What type of settlement do these things usually come to? You know, as much as I would hope, for a different outcome, what is the likely course of action as we see in the next couple of days?
Well, these protests face a lot of different challenges that makes it difficult to see them ultimately being successful, at least in this situation. And one of the things is that this is not having a clear leadership. There's some voices on the outside that are trying to claim leadership. It's clearly that they're not in charge of what's taking place. This is driven from people on the inside. But there's no clear organization behind it. There's no clear leadership that can channel the demands and channel the pressure onto the regime in a very specific way. Now, that may change. We have seen in other examples in which, something can start off being leaderless, but then leaders emerge out of the movement. But if they don't, then I think it's going to be very difficult to see how this can be successful, again, in this iteration. But this is a longer-term process. It's not just one round of protest that matters here. One thing I would be looking for is to see whether some of these labor strikes that already have taken place, if they actually will start intensifying in sympathy and solidarity with these protests. That would mean that the protests are now then starting to manifest themselves outside of just the street protest. And that could be a big change in the dynamics.
So the Trump administration policy was effectively trying to put enough pressure and squeeze Iran as a whole enough to force a potential regime change. I mean, that was kind of seemed like the goal they were pushing towards. They back out of the Iran nuclear deal. They level all of these intense sanctions, make things very difficult for the country and the people in that country economically. Is this, in a sense, a sort of vindication of that policy?
No, it's not a vindication in my view. I mean, first of all, yes, they have very specifically targeted the idea that reform is possible and has frustrated the population who are seeing no other options but to do going out and protesting and calling for regime change. But I think it's important to keep in mind what the Trump administration's objective was not regime change, it was regime collapse. They wanted to just see a complete collapse and potentially followed by a civil war. They were not championing any particular change in regime. I think the Trump administration didn't want to own the chaos that would come from a regime collapse. And I don't think that is what we're seeing. We're seeing that their policies have helped create some of the conditions that has made people all the more frustrated because of Trump pulling out of the Iran deal, the economic situation getting worse, strengthening the hardliners that are now engage in even further repression. But the idea that it would be successful, or from the standpoint of actually wanted to see movement in the right direction, would mean that this actually would lead to democratization. We're not seeing clear signs of that. We're seeing signs that people are out there protesting and calling for regime change because they're so terribly frustrated with the situation. But the lesson that was learned may have been unlearned now from 1979. It's one thing to protest against a tyrannical regime. It's a completely different thing to turn those protests into a force for democratization. In 1979, that utterly failed. A dictator was replaced with another dictator, in many ways a worse dictator.
Yeah, well, I think it's very important in order to break these things down in a very calm, manner, and that's what you've always been excellent at for our show. So we really appreciate you joining us and for describing this. And obviously, it's a bad situation, and yeah, I just hope for the best for the people there who are obviously protesting something very, very unjust. So thank you very much, sir. We appreciate that.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much for watching. We really appreciate it. We've got the discount going on right now, 10% off on annual, link in the description. And live show. Let's go ahead and buy those tickets, people. Chicago, we got to sell this thing out. Just please help us out. In the Midwest, if you're in the area, come and join us. It's going to be an awesome time. Other than that, I think we have no more administrative announcements. We'll see everybody tomorrow.
Love you guys. See you tomorrow. Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.